Okay, then I will then start the seminar. So thank you everyone for coming today. I am Ji-Eun. I am the representative of IFIT young members, and IFIT's full name is Earthquake Engineering Field Investigation Team. Investigation team which undertakes field missions whenever major earthquakes happen. Recent missions include Turkey, Syria earthquake, and Morocco earthquake. And so field missions require all sorts of expertise and experiences. So if it consists of many all sorts of professionals, including academics like myself and practitioners like Jacob, who is working at AKT2 and is also a co-organizer of this seminar series. So in relation to this, as if young members, Jacob and I are organizing this regular seminar series that invites speakers with expertise that is relevant to field missions. And today we have Dr. Vitor Silva and Dr. Anirudh Rao, who are from Global Earthquake Model Foundation and who will be talking about connecting these field missions and analytical methods for probabilistic risk modeling. And today's seminar is even more special because we are jointly organizing this with second YMSC, and Evangelos is the representative of second YMSC. So I will hand the floor over to him.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining. Let me share my screen very quickly. 1 second. Let me know when you can see.
Yes, it's working.
One moment, it's still loading from my end. Okay, can you see now? Perfect. Okay. So yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Evangelos Yfantidis, current chair of the second Young Member Subcommittee, and today we have the pleasure of welcoming you to our lunchtime webinar with the Global Earthquake Model Foundation on the earthquake loss modeling for disaster risk management. Just a few things about us. So for those who might know about us, SECED is a Society for Earthquake and Civil Engineering Dynamics and is a specialist branch affiliated with the Institution of Civil Engineers. The aim of SECED is to foster collaboration among the civil engineering community and, like if it organize professional development events focused on earthquake engineering and structural dynamics. Particularly the Young Member Subcommittee is a vibrant, diverse group of young civil engineers from both academia and industry, and we work on exciting initiatives on behalf of SECED. On the left, you can see a picture of some of our current and past group members, where we assisted with organization of the SECED 2023 conference that took place in Cambridge back in September. Just one final thing. Just wanted to say that one of our initiatives involves the very new podcast series that was launched last November with our very first episode with Mark Scorer from Saraid, and it covered the Saraid rescue mission in Turkey after the earthquake events that took place in February 2023. So if you want to find out more, you can access our podcast episode through our second website that you see here on the slide, but also through our YouTube channel. Also, please stay tuned because more episodes on various different topics will follow this year. And thank you very much. I will now hand it back to you to continue with the webinar.
Thank you, Evangelos. The podcast one is really interesting. So yeah, there's a few housekeeping rules that I need to remind everyone of. That please turn off your mic so that we wouldn't disrupt the speaker's audio. But it's okay if you turn on your video, but if you think the internet becomes unstable, then please turn off a video so that we can make the stream smoother. And we will have a Q&A session after the talk, and you can either type your questions on the chat during the seminar, and in which case I'll read those to speakers at the end of the end of their talk, or either you can raise your hand after the talk so that you can directly ask speakers yourself. So that's all, and now I will hand the floor to Vitor and Anirudh.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just try to share the screen. I'll just try to share the entire screen. Do you see my screen?
No.
Not yet.
You do not. Is it loading or something like that?
Nothing's happening.
Nothing is happening. Okay. So on my side, it says that it's sharing already. If it doesn't work, I can ask Anirudh to try to share it on my behalf. Let me try to share it again.
I think it's working.
Yeah, it's right.
Yeah, it's just Teams is slow today for some reason, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Do you see PowerPoint presentation?
I think it's loading.
It's a black screen, yeah.
I believe it will come soon.
Okay, just wait. Just 10 seconds, and if it doesn't work, then I will ask Anirudh to try to share. Teams is not great.
I agree.
I'm more of a Zoom person. Is it still black screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
So
becoming
maybe
a Zoom person.
Okay, maybe Anirudh, can you try to share? Maybe.
Yeah, let me do that.
There you go. Okay, so maybe we can start. So
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Anirudh. It's going to be one of those presentations where I'm going to be constantly saying next slide. Okay.
Yeah.
So be prepared for that.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you very much for the invitation. I had the pleasure to talk at a few second meetings and also participating in a second meetings. They're all always extremely important, interesting. And I have also attended a few of the other webinars. So it's quite nice to be able to present on these webinars now, also with the young members. So my name is Vitor Silva. I'm the head of risk engineering at the Global Earthquake Model, and I'll be talking today also with my colleague, Anirudh Rao, who's also managing the slides. Next slide. So I'll just prepare a few slides just to introduce a little bit what's GEM. I can see that a lot of people on this call actually know very well GEM because we've been working with some of these people. But GEM is a not-for-profit organization. It was founded in 2009. It's an organization with the remit to calculate and communicate earthquake risk globally, despite the fact that we work at different scales. In the last 15 years, we just celebrated our 15th anniversary, and we've been developing open tools, open data sets, open models for earthquake hazard and risk assessment, and we'll be talking about some of those data sets today. In addition to all of that, we also develop a lot of activities on capacity modeling, capacity building, and also doing a lot of regional analysis. For example, Anirudh just came back from a project in Bangladesh, and we have part of the team now in Bhutan, also on some risk analysis activities. Next one. So in terms of, this is just to show a bit of the breadth of the type of analysis that we have. So we do have a lot of regional activities, regional programs, regional projects in different parts of the world. But GEM is also a network of collaborators, and we have the pleasure to work with many people from many different places. And we have this ongoing program to train people on seismic hazard and risk analysis, and also in some vulnerability analysis. And this is just a map showing some other places where the people that have been participated in these trainings. Next one. So In terms of the products that GEM has to offer, so as I mentioned previously, we've been developing these open tools, and I know that a lot of people in this call have been using these tools. The main one, the flagship tool, is called OpenQuake. It's this open source tool that allows seismic hazard and risk calculations, and Anirudh is going to show some of these examples also for Turkey. There's also open tools to develop seismic hazard models, to test different ground motion models, to also verify the reliability and accuracy of some of the seismic hazard models. We've also developed what we call the vulnerability models toolkit, also allows developing some vulnerability functions and models, and these functions have been used in different risk models around the world. There are also a few databases. For example, there's a database of active faults. There's the database of vulnerability functions, of course. There's also a database, which I will mention towards the end of the presentation, about earthquake impact. And in different parts of the world, more than 100 events have been included there. Then there's also models. So we have a global exposure model, a global mosaic of seismic hazard models. And by combining these two components plus the vulnerability functions, we have also estimated global risk. There's earthquake scenarios for current and future conditions. Seismic risk at regional and urban scale, as I said, as part of these projects that we carry out in different countries at different resolutions. And finally, there's the training and educational material for capacity building. And this is a program that I think has been quite successful with many people from different parts of the world participating. Today, because we'll be talking about some things which are a little bit different, we thought it would be important just to list some of the main topics. So the idea is to present available exposure and vulnerability models that can be useful to prepare field missions. And a lot of the material we have included in this presentation has been based on the requests, on emails, on messages from colleagues, from friends, from partners. Every time that an earthquake happens, they will receive some of these requests. Also present how GEM is assessing earthquake impact in the days after their occurrence. Demonstrate how damage and loss data can be used to update loss models. I will focus on these first 3 points, and then Anirudh will focus on the other 3 points. So present the findings from a recent field mission, showcase some results from the World Bank project, focusing on Turkey, and we will explain why, and then also some final remarks and future directions. So to start, I just wanted to mention that GEM has a global mosaic of seismic hazard models. It's comprised by 30 models, and this is just a distribution from my colleague Marco Pagani, who leads the activities on the seismic hazard modeling within GEM. This global model is constantly being updated as there's new ground motion models are released, or there's new national models or new programs to calculate seismic hazard at the global scale. We have used these 30 models in the OpenQuake engine to calculate the global seismic hazard map. And the reason I'm including this here is because I think this map, for example, highlights right away places in different parts of the world where protocols for field missions should be in place. I actually spoke with a few colleagues from different countries where destructive events happen and nothing was in place. So they were basically in panic mode, trying to put together some protocols, taking ideas from the United States, from Italy, and doing things a bit in a rush, which obviously complicated things at the end when the data needed to be managed. So I think it's quite important. Just one of the recommendations is that we need more uniform efforts to make sure that there are protocols and classification systems that are uniform and allow us to merge data from different field missions. We have also converted this seismic hazard model into a seismic risk by bringing exposure and sets of vulnerability functions. So starting with the exposure, despite the fact that the global exposure model is at the global scale, I just want to mention that we try as much as possible to work bottom up. And this is quite important, obviously, for the preparation of the field missions. I'm just showing here the example for India, because it's a model. It's obviously a very big country. It's the country with the most population in the world now. And we work bottom up, collecting information at the smallest available administrative levels. And there's very useful information in terms of the number of buildings, dwellings, the different building classes, the cost of the buildings, the household size, the distribution of the population. And I think this is all information that is extremely useful for field missions. So we repeated this exercise for all the countries around the world, and this is what we obtain. This is now the number of buildings. We just included everything here on an evenly spaced grid for presentation purposes, but this is the number of residential, commercial, and industrial buildings at the global scale on this hexagonal grid. And now on this map, we have also the economic value of the building stock. And there's a number of other metrics that have also been included in this models, like the type of construction and the built-up area, the costs distributed per buildings and constants, and so on. On the vulnerability side, so all these different buildings that we have in this global exposure model have been classified using the GEM taxonomy, this uniform classification system. And this is going to be also relevant towards the end of the presentation, where we present some future directions, in our opinion. But we have now more than 1,000 vulnerability functions, so we can see which building classes are more vulnerable. So even before a field mission is prepared, it is possible to understand what are the building classes that are expected to exist in the region, which ones are more likely to be damaged. And this is typically, I think, quite useful to try to reduce the ambiguity. We know that often we have people from different countries going into the field missions. So you might not be entirely familiar with the types of construction and the vulnerability of the building stock. Some of, for example, the discussions that I had in the past is, how do I know that this is a reinforced masonry and not reinforced masonry? How do I know that this country have been, already using reinforced masonry? How do you do the differences between confined masonry and, let's say, reinforced concrete with infill panels? So this has to do with the construction process that was followed when building, this type of buildings. So I think there's a lot of information already here in these exposure models that can help surveyors, the people that will go into the field, to understand the type of buildings that they can find. Also, obviously, the different design regulations, ductility levels, and so on. This is information that we try as much as possible to include in these exposure models when the data is available. Also, something that we try to do on the vulnerability is not just to cover the structural part, but also the non-structural and contents. We've seen the results from many field missions, and I understand that a lot of these field missions, the main goal is forensic analysis, is to understand what went wrong, what were the failure mechanisms, why did the buildings collapse. But in terms of economic losses or disruption time, a lot of times the cause is non-structural damage, or, for example, damage in the contents. So in our opinion, it would be quite important to try to cover also these components in these field missions as much as possible. And these vulnerability models and information about these building classes already includes, I think, relevant information for surveyors before they go into the field. Now, we have put all these pieces together. So this mosaic of seismic hazard models, we use the OpenQuake engine to generate millions of seismic events globally. For each one of these events, we use a logic tree of ground motion models to calculate the ground shaking around this event. This is what we're seeing here on this map. And then at each location of the different assets, we brought in the vulnerability functions for the economic losses, for fatalities, for population being displaced, for damage, for loss of built-up area. And we calculated also seismic risk, a global seismic risk map. This is what we see here, is the average annual number of buildings that are expected to be destroyed, again, on an evenly spaced grid for presentation purposes. And this, again, highlights, for example, regions within a country, within a continent, within a particular area where this protocol should be already in place. And they also highlight the building classes that are most likely to be damaged. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that we have here some country profiles. So for each country, we have this one-page summary of relevant information for earthquake hazard and risk. So a seismic hazard map, the exposed value, average annual losses, average annual loss ratios. But we can see that there's also some plots here. One of them is these building classes, which includes the distribution of the different types of construction in a given country, either in terms of the number of buildings or in terms of the number of, in terms of the replacement cost. All this information is publicly available. For example, all these country profiles are on GitHub. And we have here the just the address, but everything else, in terms of exposure, also the sets of vulnerability functions, you can find information about this on the GEM website, and I included a few more links in this presentation. So now that we discuss a bit about the available resources for people who are preparing for field missions, whether it's shortly after the event or maybe a few months after the event, I wanted to talk a little bit more in specific about how this information can be used with some other initiatives that GEM is doing, and then also the other way around. Like, why is this data, very useful also for GEM when we need to update the models? So as I was mentioning previously, the data that we've been collecting for these countries, we try to go as much as possible to a fine spatial resolution. I'm just showing here this example for Costa Rica. And for example, you can see on this map in the middle, in the center map, that we have these codes here are the types of building classes, from confined masonry, reinforced masonry. We have reinforced concrete, precast, different types of building classes. Also the number of stories. You can see Costa Rica is already not a very large country, but you can also see that we try to go as much as possible to different administrative levels, and we try to capture also the different practices in different parts of the country. Next one. For some other parts of the world, we also have relatively detailed information that could be useful in case of an earthquake happen. I'm just showing here, this is for 3 important cities in Colombia, in Bogota, Medellin, and Cali. This was done by Professor Ana Beatriz Azevedo in a collaboration a few years ago. But this is practically at the block level, and it shows like the most common building classes. And then obviously there's also a lot of work about which vulnerability classes are vulnerable and are likely to be found damaged if an earthquake happens. Also, something that I wanted to mention is that GEM has a post-event damage and loss assessment protocol. This only started this year, despite the fact that last year we were already doing some risk analysis because of some requests from GEM partners, but a bit of ad hoc, and this year we formalized this process. This is being done within the scope of this European project called Aristotle, but also now as part of a collaboration with the World Food Programme. This is not information that you'll find publicly, let me say this up front, but just to say that GEM is doing this on the background. So if for some reason, for example, let's say that IFIT is planning a field mission in this part of the world that has been recently struck by an earthquake, we can also provide specific information about the impact for this event, and I will show some examples. For example, in this example for Turkey, we try to compile as much as possible information about the ground shaking. We work with the Azure team at GEM to understand what are the most suitable ground motion models for that particular event, the most likely geometry for the event. We used a lot of information from the USGS shake map. I think you've all seen, the pager reports and the shake maps after those events. And this tool, OpenQuake, is actually compatible with the shake maps from the USGS, and also allows calculating ground shaking in a region, considering the data that was recorded on these seismic stations. Then we put all these things together, and we also calculate the impact. So for example, here is just where do we expect more economic losses, displaced people. I will not focus that much on this part because actually Anirudh will cover in more detail some of the activities that were done for this event in Turkey. These maps have also been included in some of these initiatives. We work closely, for example, with the Joint Research Center, but this project called Aristotle also informs the civil protection branch of the European Union. And for example, for this particular case, I remember that they told us that the European Union had allocated 1 million euros in support for Morocco. I don't remember exactly where some of the representatives from the European Union were. I think it was in the north of Morocco, if I remember correctly, but they were planning to move these representatives to the places that were more affected within Morocco. And we were providing some information on the days after the event to understand where more damage was likely to occur. Despite the fact that we're not including a lot of detail in these maps, I just want to mention that we provide the damage, we calculate the damage, the distribution of damage, but also doing disaggregation in terms of spatial, right? So different administrative divisions, but also the different building classes. So where do we expect, for example, reinforced concrete to have damage, unreinforced masonry, adobe, like all these different building classes. And we also estimate fatalities and the population that is expected to be left homeless. So this is information that can be provided after the occurrence of destructive events. So just to provide here a bit of a summary, but we will talk more about this at the end of the presentation. So this information that GEM currently has might be useful to identify the most likely types of construction in the affected region, the building classes that are more likely to suffer damages, which building classes are expected to suffer also non-structural damage and contents loss, because we know that sometimes it's not easy from the outside to infer damage in non-structural components and contents. And finally, it might also highlight the regions where we should expect to have higher concentrations of damage. And this can be quite useful, for example, on the days after the event, because there's still not a lot of information on the days after the event. So this type of models, I think, are quite useful on the first days before we actually have the ground truth. Now, just to talk the other way around, what about how have we been trying to use this field data to now improve these probabilistic models? The models are far from perfect. And if the models were perfect, then in these plots that you see here, we would be predicting exactly the number of destroyed buildings and exactly the economic losses that were observed. Okay, on the bottom axis, we have the observed number of destroyed buildings, or the losses. These plots are a little bit old, so they were done in 2018. And then on the y-axis is basically what was predicted by some of these models. You might think that, oh, you know, the correlation seems to be okay. Yes, but this is in log-log scale, and everything looks better in log-log scale, okay? But we can see that for some of these events, we were missing the losses, either overestimating or underestimating by 1 order of magnitude. So clearly, there is the need to improve the ground shaking estimation, the vulnerability, and also the exposure modeling. So the way that we've been doing this is we look at these past events, some of them historical, some of them recent, and we basically try to replicate what were those losses. So we grab our exposure model, the sets of fragility and vulnerability functions. We try to understand how much, what was the ground shaking in a region, and we estimate damage maps, damage statistics, loss maps, loss statistics. So we calculate all these variables. So we can see that basically we have these 3 components that in theory can be calibrated with information that might be collected on the field. So starting with the ground shaking. During the field missions, of course, the main purpose is try to collect damage information and information about the building stock. But we noticed that sometimes there is information from seismic stations that it's not necessarily available online. We noticed that some seismic stations might not be connected to, let's say, to the National Seismic Network, or in some of the countries, there's more than one network, okay? There's also very good information that can be retrieved from the shake map system, again, from the USGS. But we also noticed that for some of the countries, not all the stations are connected, again, to this global network that is used by the USGS shake map. So there is room during this field missions to try to collect additional information, either from seismic stations that might not be connected to the national network or just available online through the typical websites. And still on the ground shaking side, it is fundamental to try to collect additional information about the soil conditions. And I understand that a lot of times, you know, engineers is going to the field, they want to see the collapsed building. They want to understand why the building collapsed. But it is fundamental to really understand how much was the ground shaking at the base of that building. What were the site conditions? Do we have different types of soils that might have amplified or attenuated the ground shaking? You might understand the failure mechanism, but you might not really understand what was the reason this building collapsed for this level of ground shaking. And for example, for this exercise here in New Zealand, can we go back, Anirudh? For this exercise here in New Zealand, we noticed that once we incorporated the data from the stations, we managed to calculate a loss that was much closer to the actual loss. When we did not include seismic stations, the losses were being overestimated by 1 billion New Zealand dollars. So there's also a lot of work that can be done on the exposure. If you press play, Anirudh. This is actually something that we had to do for for Turkey, because of this World Bank project that Anirudh will be talking about. We changed the exposure model, but we were under the assumption that most of the modern buildings in Turkey were built according to the latest design regulation. But then once we started seeing some of the images from this event, we noticed that some of the modern buildings actually collapse. So our assumption in our exposure model that all the modern buildings in Turkey were code compliant, ductile, and resilient to earthquakes was not correct. So this information from the, and we've done the same thing, for example, for the 2008 event in China. So information that is collected on the fields about the different types of building classes is also extremely useful for us to revise the mapping schemes, revise our assumptions on the exposure model. And sometimes the trend is to include more vulnerable building classes. But it could also be the other way around, to understand that some of the buildings are actually better than anticipated. So again, the data from the field missions is useful for us to update the exposure model. This is just another example where we can see that a building, I don't think it's a modern building, but I also don't think it's that old and it collapsed. So this allows us to update, the mapping schemes that we use for the development of the exposure models. Finally, just on the last category, we have the fragility models. So if you really think that the ground shaking is correct, because perhaps you had a lot of seismic stations close to your buildings, if you really think that you have classified your building correctly, this is an unreinforced masonry building, and I have no doubts about that. But still, your prediction of damage are still very biased, still quite far from the ground truth. It is worth for us to understand. Maybe it's the fragility and vulnerability. And I think a lot of the cases, it is exactly the fragility and the vulnerability. So we also repeat these past events using as much as possible the data that was collected on the field. I just included here an example for Japan, the Kumamoto earthquake, because the Japanese are fantastic on the level of detail that is collected after destructive events. But we can see here a column for the reported impact, and then 2 columns for the openquake estimates from the complete and collapse damage. I think, given all the uncertainties that exist, these estimates were not that far off, but we had several examples in other parts of the world where the results were at least 1 order of magnitude different from the observations. So it was also quite important for us to understand, okay, we need to update the fragility because this is not in line with the observations. Next one, Anirudh. Yeah. So I think this is my last slide. Just to say that we've been trying also to make sure that we create this uniform database for impact data for model validation. And this is something that Anirudh will also talk on his last slide. But there are a few databases that compile very good information, maybe again for forensic analysis to understand the causes of failure of some of the buildings. But there are less resources for model validation, where I can have the number of buildings in the region, all the buildings that were damaged, all the buildings that were not damaged, with good information also about the ground shaking, about the data that was recorded on the seismic stations. And GEM has been trying to create this database. It has more than 100 events now, and this is something that we want to continue updating in the future. But I also invite you to check this resource and provide data if you have that. Okay. So now Anirudh is going to continue the presentation, also showing for this particular case of Turkey, how we have incorporated this data in the different phases. You are on mute, Anirudh.
Yeah, can you hear now?
Yes.
Good. Thanks, Vitor, for the first part of the talk. And this is continuing on the same theme. So what are the different ways in which we can link field mission data with these probabilistic earthquake risk models and vice versa. So I've structured this part of the talk in 3 parts. So looking at these linkages or potential linkages before an earthquake happens, then also during an event. So in, let's say, the 1 week or 2 weeks when an event happens, and then post-event, how we can bring back some of the information from field surveys back into these probabilistic risk models. So starting with the pre-event phase. So all of this is, I'm going through this talk in the context of Turkey, because we were fortunate enough to have worked on building or improving our seismic risk model for Turkey just 1.5 years before the events of last year. So we were contacted in 2021 by the World Bank. The World Bank was looking to provide a large loan to the government of Turkey on the order of $260 million, which would be followed up with another loan of $150 or $200 million. And the aim of this loan was to help the government of Turkey to undertake retrofits of vulnerable structures, specifically public buildings, and do a kind of a joint seismic and energy efficiency upgrade retrofit. So they wanted us to build both an exposure model covering the entire building stock of Turkey, and also a seismic risk model, which would help prioritize which are these public buildings that if you retrofit them, would yield the most benefit over the long term. So we began with the seismic hazard model. We have a few open source seismic hazard models available in the OpenQuake format that cover Turkey. One of them was the European seismic hazard model from 2013 called SHARE that covers Turkey. There's also the Middle East seismic hazard model from 2014 that also covers Turkey. There's the National Seismic Hazard Map model for Turkey that also was built for the OpenQuake engine. And then recently, there's also been an update of the European seismic hazard model that's also based in the OpenQuake format. So there's multiple seismic hazard models covering Turkey. So we were fortunate enough to have something ready to work with. So we didn't have to spend time on this aspect of the seismic risk model. On the other hand, we spent quite a bit of time on developing an exposure model for Turkey. And this was essentially to create a snapshot of the building stock of Turkey. One great data source was the 2000 building census that provides a wealth of information on what the building stock of Turkey was in the year 2000. But then to bring it up to date, we also looked at the building permits issued from 2001 to 2020. And so our exposure model was brought up to the year 2020. This still misses out some of the, let's say, the non-engineer or irregular buildings that were constructed without applying for building permits. So that is definitely something that's missing in the model. And we tried to work at a spatial resolution that was fine enough to help locate these buildings at the neighborhood level in urban areas and at the village level in rural areas. So our exposure model for Turkey covers 16 different occupancy classes, going all the way from residential, commercial, industrial, educational, healthcare, government, and so on. And there's also quite a few different mixed occupancy classes where you have combined commercial, residential, or combined industrial, residential, and so on. Another thing that we need to characterize in these exposure models is the structural types. Here in this just image, you're seeing how the construction in the country has been evolving over time as the country becomes wealthier. Going back to the 1960s, a lot of the building stock was these unreinforced masonry single-family houses, still unreinforced masonry in the 1970s. But then moving into the 80s and 90s, there's more and more reinforced concrete construction mixed residential and commercial kind of construction with these soft storage mechanisms in the ground floor. So we're trying hard to capture all of these different attributes: the construction age, the structural type, number of stories, and so on in our exposure model. These are just different snapshots of the distribution of the building stock by structural type, occupancy class, construction era. This is at the national level. But of course, we know that these statistics can change and vary quite a lot geographically within the country. And so we're also, then the next step was to look at this breakdown of the building types by province. For example, here you see at the province level for 3 different provinces, all in the Marmara region. We're just looking at 2 structural types: reinforced concrete frame structures and masonry bearing wall kind of construction. For Istanbul, which is highly urban, what we see is that the unreinforced masonry construction peaked in the 1970s, and then since then, almost all of the construction has been reinforced concrete. Whereas in less urban provinces like Tekirdağ, the masonry construction continued to peak up to the 1980s, and then we start seeing the decline of masonry and the rise of reinforced concrete. And similar things can be said about the building heights and so on as well. So in the urban areas, you'll see more taller RC buildings, whereas in rural areas, you'll see a predominance of low-rise construction in the one-story to 3-story range. But for earthquake risk assessment purposes, even the province level spatial resolution is probably too coarse. So during this project, we tried to improve the spatial resolution of the exposure model down to the neighborhood level and the village level, as I mentioned. And this is quite important because locating the buildings close to where you would expect to find them on the ground is critical when you're assessing, bringing together hazard, exposure, vulnerability to estimate the risk. So through our exposure models, because of all of this work that has gone into trying to characterize the building stock of Turkey at this spatial resolution, it would be very easy for people who are planning field missions to try and extract characteristics of the building stock in specific areas. So if you're just looking at the areas affected by the 2023 earthquakes, you can try and pull out from our exposure model information just for those affected areas and try and understand before even going to the field what is the makeup of the building stock that you might expect to encounter when you reach the field. The next part is trying to.
I think we just from here to and 4 again.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry about that. Can everybody
Yeah.
mute their mics, please? Thank you.
The next component is to try and characterize the structural fragility and vulnerability, where essentially we're trying to look at all of these different building types and trying to understand with increasing levels of seismic intensity what their structural behavior is likely to be like, and what kinds of damage we might expect to see, and what kinds of economic losses, fatalities, and other consequences we might expect to see. So we do need to do that for all of these different types of buildings that we expect to see in Turkey. And that's another challenging task with lots of uncertainties involved. One of the aspects in which field survey data can be useful when we're doing this mapping of building classes with exposure to specific vulnerability functions in our global vulnerability database is trying to understand how seismic design regulations have evolved in different countries. In this case, we're looking at different building seismic design regulations in Turkey, different design codes. Here, we're just looking at the recommended base shear coefficients from different design codes over time. And that has a direct impact on which kinds of vulnerability functions we would like to assign to different reinforced concrete structures built in different eras. However, another important aspect is we need to know whether these design regulations are actually being followed on the ground in construction in reality. And that's where previous field survey reports and data collected is very useful. To inform our risk model for this World Bank project, we did look at previous EFIT field reports from the 1999 Kocaeli earthquake and from the 2011 Van earthquake. And often there's good qualitative description of the types of structural damage that were seen for different building types and whether or not basic provisions from the design code are being followed on the ground or not. And this is also critical to do this well for different parts of the country because the Istanbul area might be very different from the eastern parts of the country. So field survey information is definitely very useful in the pre-event probabilistic risk modeling phase. And then once we have all of these components, typically we're trying to estimate these are on an average annual basis. What is the expected number of fatalities at the province level, or it could even go down to the district level. And this is where these kinds of maps and tables help target areas that might be at higher risk and identifying structures that would be placed at a higher priority list for retrofit considerations. Here, that's what the previous map was looking at average annual fatalities at the province level. And then here we're looking at average annual economic losses also at the province level. But the World Bank was also interested not only looking at an estimation of the average annual losses as of today, in this case it was the year 2020, but they also wanted to understand if current construction practices were to continue in the near future, what would the risk look like in the next decade? So we did the same analysis projecting the exposure and vulnerability into the future, assuming similar construction practices as today. What would be the economic losses in 2030, 2040, and 2050? And so we can create plots like this, which are showing the expected trajectories of the seismic risk if no intervention actions are taken. And then the World Bank was also curious to see if we were to start implementing some measures such as strict code enforcement for all buildings that are constructed post 2020. And then slowly over time, every 10 years, you try and retrofit some of the high risk buildings that were constructed before 2020. And if you do these kinds of simulations, here's our projection of what would be the expected decrease in the risk here measured in terms of average annual losses over the next 30 years. And we see that initially the risk is still increasing, but at a slower rate than if no measures were taken. And then once you start bringing more and more of the buildings into this retrofit scheme, then the risk starts even reducing over time. But one of the problems, as I mentioned before, is this kind of modeling involves a lot of assumptions on our part, especially about the actual structural performance of these different kinds of buildings. And that's where field data can play a big role, because, for example, now after the 2023 earthquakes, there's a wealth of information coming in through different field survey teams and their reports and their data sets that will help us refine these kinds of estimates. And these estimates are very useful for the government to formulate policies, allocate resources, and for institutions like the World Bank to allocate funds in the form of loans for governments to help undertake these kinds of risk reduction activities. Now, that was pre-event, the potential linkages between field data and risk modeling. But now I'm going to talk a bit about the activities that we undertook in the days and weeks after the tragic events of February 2023. Vitor already mentioned briefly that we were contacted by many of our partners especially the European Commission, the World Food Programme, asking us if we could share any information about estimated ground shaking, economic losses, damaged buildings, and displaced persons. So since we had developed this probabilistic risk model for this World Bank project that was quite recent and up to date, we were able to use many of the same components at the exposure and vulnerability to try and estimate these metrics and share them with these partners. One of the important things to note is when an event happens, initially there's almost no information, and then within a few minutes you might receive information about the magnitude and maybe the hypocenter, depth, latitude and longitude of the event, but not more. And so your initial estimates are often based on very, very simple parameters of the earthquake. But then in the next few hours, or maybe even in the next few days, more information starts coming in. You might be able to access a more refined prediction of the geometry of the rupture itself, finite fault rupture models become available, and these help refine your estimates of ground shaking. Similarly, in this case, the Disaster Management Authority of Turkey, AFAD, has several seismic stations located throughout the country, on the order of 300 stations, that recorded the ground shaking from these events. And that data was also became available. Here we're showing a map of these stations and the seismic intensity that they recorded. The map is from the USGS Shake Map system, where the data is coming from AFAD. And these recorded shaking intensity estimates help us condition our ground motion estimates for the affected region. So they help us condition the ground shaking estimates in the places where there are no stations. And these help reduce the amount of uncertainty that we have in our model estimates of damage and losses. Similarly, something that we have not been doing so far, but that has the potential to become another valuable addition to this tool chain, is if early reports of damage start coming in, depending on location, building type, and if these are conducted by reputed institutions and these become available in the few hours after the event, then these early reports of damage could also be helpful for conditioning the fragility and vulnerability models that we are using in this analysis, because even those have large amounts of uncertainty, and any information that comes in from the field can help us reduce the uncertainty in that component of the model, and again, improve our estimates of damage, losses, and fatalities. Now that's pre-event and during the event. Now looking at the third phase, which is maybe after the event. Here, I'm going to just show a few slides on a field survey that we undertook. This was 4 months after the event, so around in June 2023. This was a team put together by Kishore Jaiswal from the USGS with some funding that was generously provided by USAID, the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs. And we had a team comprising faculty and a few graduate students from Koeri in Istanbul, the Middle Eastern Technical University in Ankara, and Hacettepe also in Ankara. And from GEM, it was 2 people who joined this field survey team. Now, contrary to most field surveys, as Vitor mentioned, I think typically the primary motivation for field surveys is forensic analysis to understand what went wrong, what was not done right in terms of either structural design or not following basic ductile detailing measures and so on, so that lessons could be learned and transferred to the structural engineering and construction community to help prevent future events of the same magnitude of consequences. But here, our mission had a slightly different objective, which is more related to the risk modeling that we're doing. So try and understand what are the big gaps in our understanding of the built environment, of the vulnerability, and what can we learn from what's happened on the field to improve our risk models. Some key considerations that we were entering the country quite a few months after the earthquake, so most of the collapsed and severely damaged buildings had already been removed. And so we were mostly surveying buildings that had moderate or damage or lower. And we wanted to avoid repeating work that was done by previous field survey teams, especially teams like Yfantidis that do an excellent job of field survey. And one of our main goals was to focus mostly on buildings that were located in the immediate surroundings of the seismic station. So we have a good control on what was the observed level of ground shaking. So at least one of the two variables in the seismic fragility functions is controlled. And then we are trying to just record the different levels of damage for different building types around these stations. So we did manage to cover a large portion of the areas affected by the two main earthquakes in February 2023. And as I mentioned, most of our stops were around the towns where Afad had existing field service stations, seismic stations. So I won't go through like the details of the damage observations that we were recording, but we had created a field survey app that was able to capture the major building attributes for the buildings that we were surveying: number of stories, construction type, and the expected year of construction, which would have been a guess because we did not know the exact ranges, and also then doing an assessment of the structural and non-structural damage, trying to characterize them into 5 damage grades, going from no damage all the way to complete damage or collapse. And so overall, over a period of 5.5 days, we managed to cover around 11 towns or cities and recorded the damage grades for around 550 buildings. Some of our key observations were that, in general, low-rise structures seem to have fared relatively better than mid-rise structures. And then here's the part where, again, we're trying to link this data recorded in the field back to our risk models. So coming back to Pavia, to our GEM offices, there are some slides that were put together by my colleague, Luis Martins at GEM, who is our in-house expert on seismic fragility and vulnerability. And here we're just starting to compare our existing seismic vulnerability models for these different building classes. Here we're looking at low-rise reinforced concrete movement frame structures with masonry infill that were pre-2000. And we're looking at our damage data collected in the field and trying to compare that with our existing functions. And here on the right, we have mid-rise reinforced concrete masonry infill structures, also pre-2000. And we're just trying to see if our existing models are able to capture the damage that we're actually observing on the field. And the next step would be to obviously update our functions if you're seeing big deviations in the prediction power. The same thing for post-2000 construction, which are expected to fare better because in general, the building code enforcement is supposed to have improved in the country after 99 or 2000. And again, we're trying to compare our existing functions for these building types with the data that we observed from the field. And as you'll notice, there are big variations, or there's a large amount of uncertainty in the data that we're collecting in the field, because we're seeing ranges here because that's how we estimated the level of damage. So we had ranges going from 0 to 5%, damage 5 to 15%, 15 to 30%, 30 to 60%, or 60 to 100%, where the percentages refer to the expected loss ratio based on our assessment of the overall damage to the structural components and to the non-structural components. Something else we're also looking at is in our vulnerability functions, we have assignments for the code level and the system ductility level. And so here we're looking at moderate code, low ductility functions. Here we're looking at moderate code, moderate ductility functions, and trying to see which ones compare better with what we're seeing on the field. So this is post-event how we are trying to use data collected on the field to improve our vulnerability models and risk models, which will again feed back into, let's say, the pre-event models before the next event. So some of our final observations and some suggestions for future directions on this topic of trying to link field damage data with risk models is that in one way, the existing exposure, vulnerability, and seismic risk models that GEM and others are developing can help inform the planning of field missions, because you can extract information from the exposure for the affected areas to highlight the predominant building classes, as well as try and understand the locations where damage is likely to be concentrated. If you're planning the field mission much later than the event, then you might actually have some observed damage as well, and this might become irrelevant. But if you're still in the first few days or weeks after the event, these models can help you extract this kind of information. On the other hand, in the other direction, damage data that has been collected in field missions are really vital for the work that we do. They help in validating earthquake risk models, and they also help us to update our exposure models and calibrate existing vulnerability functions, filling in places where we lack knowledge and new information gets exposed after earthquakes. One observation is that unfortunately, there's still no global consensus on uniform protocols for damage data collection. Often different countries are doing this in very different ways, and it becomes difficult to use data across different countries to update models. And therefore, additional efforts are necessary to help classify structural and non-structural damage in a uniform manner. And this data should ideally become available in a format that enables risk model validation. So I think that was my last slide. And this is just a slide to thank all of the different public and private sponsors and partners of GEM that help make this kind of work possible. And thanks a lot for your time and attention. And both Vitor and I would be happy to take questions and open it up for discussions.
Thank you, Vitor and Anirudh, right? Anirudh. Yeah. So we have several questions on the chat. So the first question is from Catherine, and this is also what I was wondering about, that do you have any recommendation for EFIT, if how we can collect data in a consistent manner and then incorporate them into GEM's database?
Maybe I can take this one. So obviously, GEM is not an expert in terms of field data collection. In fact, I think it's more like the other way around. If it has a much more experience in the field data collection, we can, however, highlight some success stories on our side. For example, we have developed a few years ago this taxonomy, this classification system for buildings, and I think this has been very useful for us, but we've seen this classification system being used by dozens of projects and publications, out there. And this helps a lot because basically allow us to compare buildings between Indonesia and Mexico, because it's the same language that we're talking about between different locations. So if the buildings that in the near future will be, characterized by Yfit on the field, also use a similar approach, like a uniform taxonomy, both to classify the buildings and also to classify the damage, I think it will make the data much easier to use for model validation or for any other purposes. Also, something that we've seen, for example, I remember that it was in the earthquake in Nepal. We got impact data, and a lot of impact data was also included on the GEM ECD on this database for Cambridge, from the University of Cambridge. And there was different people going into the field and collecting building data and also classifying the buildings according to the damage. But they were using different approaches. Again, different scales to classify the damage, and different ways to classify the buildings. So it was just a little bit more complicated than to merge the data from all these different field missions, even within the same event. And also something that I've seen some years ago was that even when some of the teams were using similar terms for the damage state, they say it's moderate damage, and this other team also says that it's moderate damage. But their assumption of moderate damage was different, So despite the fact that even the name for the same damage state was being used, their assumptions were different. It just makes it a little bit more complicated to then merge all the data. So at least on my side, from somebody that has been using this field data, this type of data for model validation for a long time, I think there's three main recommendations. The first one is that I think it is really important to have a uniform system to classify the damage that classifies not just structural damage, also non-structural and constants and so on. That's one recommendation. The other recommendation, and this recommendation, it's a little bit selfish, because it's from somebody that does model validation. But I understand that a lot of times, engineers care only about the buildings that collapsed, and obviously that's very important. But for model validation, it's really important to try to capture the maximum number of buildings possible, from structural damage, the buildings that suffer structural damage, collapse, complete damage, but also moderate, extensive, even the buildings that were not damaged. That's extremely important because we need both tails of the vulnerability function, all the way from this building collapse all the way to what was the levels of damage that the building did not collapse, and level of ground shaking that the building did not suffer damage. And the final thing is that I hope that there will be room in the future to also try to take advantage that people are on the field to also collect some information about the ground shaking, about microzonation studies, about cell conditions, because that's also extremely important to understand why there was some damage on the buildings.
Yeah. This is a little bit of a side question that how field missions can investigate ground motion itself?
Yeah. So I think there's been some very interesting studies about there. Yeah, I think maybe I know that some of you were at the European conference, and there was this presentation by Professor Dimitri Van Vatsicus, and it was showing how some precarious rocks or tombs and cemeteries can be used to try to understand how much was the ground shaking in the region. And I talked with Dimitris about that also for building damage. If we have a good confidence on the fragility of some of the buildings, and we've seen that sometimes the buildings did not collapse and others collapse, then we can calculate backwards what would be the ground shaking that would be necessary to cause a certain amount of damage on these buildings. This is also a little bit what is done when we're trying to classify hazard intensities in terms of macroseismic intensities, right? It has to do with the observations, and we classify the intensities of the earthquakes using macroseismic intensities. So I think it might be possible for us to, to back calculate how much was the ground shaking, but I also think it might become a little bit circular. If you estimate the ground shaking using the damage, then how do you know that the damage was not miscalculated?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think another question is controversial. So it is from Aaron asking about if GEM Foundation suggests control measures after the assessment of the infrastructures to the client or stakeholders. Countermeasures. It's not very.
I think what they might mean is like retrofit interventions. Sorry to butt in.
Sure, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe Anirudh can comment a little bit about that because of the retrofitting techniques I used both for the project in Indonesia and also the project in Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, Catherine is aware of the work that we've been doing with the World Bank in Indonesia, and here we're trying to work with the government to look at different potential retrofit techniques for different building types, and trying to see what would be the expected reduction in seismic risk over the next few decades. But this is pre any event. But after events like Turkey, I mean, something similar could be done. And this is something that we did even before the event. That's what I was mentioning in my part of the presentation, where with the World Bank, we were looking at retrofit measures only for public buildings controlled by the government to see if how we can reduce or decrease the risk trajectory over time.
But yeah, it was also an interesting point that during your presentation, you saw this increasing losses as no intervention is taken and time goes by. Then what is the factors of this increasing loss?
It's mostly the increase in population, increase in building stock, increase in the valuation of the building stock as it goes from non-engineered masonry to more and more reinforced concrete.
But it is not.
Valuation,
But it is not from deterioration of existing buildings.
No, that's not something that we've included, yes.
So, thank you. And there is another question from Yfantidis asking about how an individual interested in collaborating with GEM can connect to your organization, not as institutions.
Yeah, feel free just to, I think a lot of our contacts can be found on our website. I certainly, Anirudh and my contact are both on the website. Just feel free just to reach out. And indeed, we have an ongoing project in Nepal, and I can see that the question was specifically about Nepal. So always quite happy to collaborate even with individuals. And we also receive frequently, people from different countries, just to spend some period working with us at GEM. So I think there's a lot of possibilities.
Even for Nepal, maybe I will add one more thing, that NSET has collected damage information for hundreds of thousands of buildings after the Gorkha earthquake. And they've made that available to us to help in this exercise of calibrating and validating our existing risk model for Nepal. So we're closely working with NSET on this activity. And that would be something that we would like to see happen in other parts of the world as well, where this kind of detailed building level damage assessment data sets become available publicly. And that will be extremely useful for many different aspects, but for us specifically, it would be useful for improving our risk models.
Andrew, great. And I think the next one is I think there is this question that if GEM is also working on the seismic vulnerability functions of infrastructures from Rohan, from Miyamoto International, and I guess by infrastructures, they mean other structures than buildings.
Yeah, only on specific projects. So we had a specific project which was for, I think it was sort of a chemical plant, for example, in a particular location in Indonesia. And we also have a project now where we are covering the road network for 3 countries. So for specific projects yet, but not in the systematic, manner like we're doing for buildings, So we don't have, like, whilst we have a global vulnerability database for buildings, we don't have one, for example, for bridges or dams or sewage system or this type of elements that are, obviously very different from buildings.
But do you have any plans to incorporate it? No.
No, we do. I mean, in the long term, of course, we're starting with the long hanging fruit, right? It's a little bit easier to cover buildings because there's so much, so many models, so much research about that. In the long term, of course, the map that I was showing in my presentation about this global seismic risk, we would love to include other elements, not just buildings, but also infrastructure. We would love to include other sources of damage, like not just ground shaking, but also, liquefaction and landslides and tsunamis. But this is like the very long term.
I see. And I think the next one is from Mia Tucker Rockhead, asking about in the exposure part of these models, what is the process like for understanding the building topology distribution at such a detailed scale? Is this done using field visits or remote sensing data?
You can take this one, Anirudh.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It might be different from country to country because in each country we might have access to different databases of information. One of the primary sources of this information is usually the population and housing census. Often the housing censuses of different countries are collecting these attributes that are useful for classifying structures. So it could be like wall material, roof material, floor material, number of stories, year of construction. So often the building censuses, or in the case of Turkey, there was a building census in 2000. And then every year after that, there are building permit databases that provide this kind of information. But usually it's at an aggregated scale. And so if you want to improve the spatial resolution, then you need to bring in secondary data sets. So for building heights, there are global data sets like this global settlement footprint that provides well-calibrated estimates of building heights at a reasonably fine resolution. Then also at the neighborhood level, often we're looking at Google Street View images and so on to see how the construction patterns are changing from one part of the country to the other. So these are different ways in which we try and bring the different kinds of information into the exposure model.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think there are also too many people saying that they really enjoyed your presentation, as we did. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there are a couple of more questions in the chat. So there is one from Kostas Georgopoulos of the Kahramanmaras earthquake in 2023. Says most of the damages were the same with the ones recorded by IFIT for the Kocaeli earthquake in 1999. The causes are the same too. For example, no compliance with the code, poor quality of materials, no seismic detailing of reinforcement, etc. How to take this into account in a vulnerability model? I understand this might not be very straightforward.
Yeah, but it's a fantastic question, right?
Yeah.
It's a 1 million euros question. So I think there's at least 2 stages where this type of information needs to be incorporated in these risk models. The first stage is on the exposure, as we were explaining previously. So just the fact that a building was built recently, we don't automatically say, oh, this is going to be code compliant and it's in a high seismic zonation, so automatically this is going to have a high ductility. No, we also use a factor that we typically call the enforcement level, right? There's design regulations in some of the countries where we completely ignore when we're building the exposure model because we know the design regulations are going to be neglected. So now the question is between a 0% enforcement and 100% enforcement, where do we stop, right? And this is where I think this type of missions can help us to understand what was the fraction of buildings that appeared to be modern, but we see that they were not code compliant. But so the first stage is when we build these mapping schemes that we convert the raw data that Anirudh was mentioning from the housing census into this exposure model that is used in risk analysis. We need to do assumptions. What is the fraction of buildings that we put into the no compliance with code, poor quality of materials, and so on? So we distribute the buildings in these building classes. The second stage is, of course, okay, now I need vulnerability functions for all these different building classes, including the stuff that is not code compliant. And what we typically do is to try to define, capacity models that represent this type of construction. Okay, so what is the expected yielding drift, the ultimate drift, the maximum base year capacity? Do we see that the infill panels actually contributed to the response of the building? And this is again a lot of information that we see from the observations. The lack of detailing because of the shear that we have in the columns and beams. It's stuff that we use in order to try to update this capacity models, and it's quite complicated, as you said. It's not a straightforward answer because I think it also varies with the different types of building classes that we have, but we try to incorporate in these two stages.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there is also a comment on this question that you just answered. It says, there are also ground shaking records that are way out of the global earthquake model and hazard calculations, and also the codes have foreseen. This first has to be corrected, and then we can validate the question further.
Yeah, I think the GMM, it's actually the ground motion model, right? Because we've seen that there's been extremely, and Anirudh was showing in his presentations, places with close to 2G in different parts of Turkey, which was higher than the design regulations. And I know that some people said, well, some buildings did collapse, it's true, but the level of ground shaking that was experienced in Turkey was also above the ground shaking that was used for design. I think that's valid, and then one could say that, well, maybe the seismic hazard should be higher for these regions, or it could simply mean that the return period that corresponds to this ground shaking was extremely rare. It was not the return period that was used for the design of the buildings. So, but this is a very good question, because I think as this person whose name is Yensim is saying, did the buildings collapse because we simply exceeded the level of ground shaking, or did the buildings collapse because of the poor detailing and so on? I think this is probably something that is going to have to be addressed mostly by the earthquake engineers in Turkey that understand much more about the local seismic hazard and construction practices. But it's a very good question.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another one on the chat. Is there a unified, freely accessible database that showcases the damaged states of individual buildings observed during field missions in Turkey following the 2023 earthquake events? If not, where can one find detailed analysis and observations of the damages caused by these earthquakes?
Maybe I can take it. So I don't think there's an officially released database of the building damage that survey that was carried out by AFAD, at least. In the early days, there was like a version of this preliminary damage assessment at the building level that became available, but it was never released officially. So I'm not sure that has ever been officially released. So maybe if there are some people from Turkey in the call, maybe they might have more information on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't see
I
any.
think, Can I ask just one last question as an EFIT member? So, like these days, this remote data are very advanced that like you can easily see what buildings have been collapsed and what have been not. But then, do you find any kind of a very original usefulness of field data compared to this remote data?
You go first, Anirudh, and then
Yeah.
I will also say my 2 cents.
Yeah, so from remote sensing data, maybe you can, there were some assessments that we saw for Turkey, some based on optical satellite images, but the problem in this earthquake specifically was there was a lot of cloud cover over the affected areas. There was snow falling, that made it very difficult to capture damage accurately through optical satellite images. But there were also attempts made to try and understand damage through SAR, radar, satellite images. But this is often not possible to do at the building level, and it's still not at a stage where you can get building level accuracy in the estimates. And often different kinds of noise also reduces the accuracy of these estimates. Yeah. But yeah, we're seeing the trend in these remote methods tending towards more accuracy over time.
Maybe just very quickly, just on this part, because Anirudh and I actually also work with the World Bank on trying to use remote sensing, and we were very excited about doing this because we also had some meetings with this particular department of NASA, and they were at Caltech, and they were issuing all these damage proxy maps. And I saw the damage proxy maps, and they look very promising, you know, for the 2016 Central Italy earthquake, if I'm not mistaken. We then tried to use this in a few other events, including Nepal, including Croatia. I think it was also Mexico, Anirudh. And the results were mixed. I mean, if you have a lot of information prior to the event, like the location of the buildings and the type of construction of the buildings, then you can cross this with satellite data, and the results, I think, are quite acceptable. But if it's basically just damage proxy maps after the event, and you don't have a lot of information prior to the event about the location of the buildings and the type of construction, I don't think the results are very good. And I remember when we did this analysis for Croatia, I was, you know, a bit frustrated because I thought this was going to be, you know, game changing. And then I went to Croatia, and I went to some of these buildings that they were tagged, I think red alert, if I'm not mistaken, sorry, red tag or maybe yellow tag. But in our assumptions, you know, the damage proxy maps were not giving us any changes. And the colleagues from Croatia were fantastic. You know, they took us to these specific buildings, and then I could understand, like, a lot of these buildings from the outside, you would see like some cracks, you know, on the walls and some damage, but then the inside of the building was completely destroyed. You know, in particular, like these older buildings, like sometimes even the floor would collapse, but from the outside you wouldn't see a lot of damage. So I think the remote sensing is very promising, granted that you do this holistically. So considering other data sets, like, for example, OpenStreetMap, you know, the shake maps from the USGS, you know, a few other data sets that can provide some additional information. Because we noticed that in Croatia, a lot of times we had like damage proxy maps above one, like, sorry, close to one, a factor close to one, and it was just cars that were no longer there, or the trees were different. Okay, so it's just something that we need to take into account in these methodologies.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I can see there are a couple of questions in the chat, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So maybe we can take this away and we can answer them later on. That's okay? Okay. Thank you so much, both. That was a very interesting and excellent presentation. Thank you for accepting our invitation and delivering this.
Yeah, thanks a lot for
Yeah,
this.
thank you. It was really useful. And the recordings will be available soon, as Marco kindly explained. So if you need it, yeah, so stay tuned. And thank you again for our
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
the seminar. So thank you everyone for coming today. I am Ji-Eun Byun. I am the representative of Yfit young members, and Yfit's full name is Earthquake Engineering Field Investigation Team. Investigation team which undertakes field missions whenever major earthquakes happen. Recent missions include Turkey, Syria earthquake, and Morocco earthquake. And so field missions require all sorts of expertise and experiences. So Yfit consists of many all sorts of professionals, including academics like myself, and